Hi everyone and welcome. Great to see you all. Hopefully joining for a fantastic session ahead. For those of you who don't already know, Instant Impact internal recruitment and diversity experts. So we build, run and support high-performing in-house recruitment functions, providing the team, technology, marketing and expertise that our clients need to hire the very best diverse talent. Today's webinar is the latest in our series of webinars on driving diversity through recruitment, and we'll be focusing on how to build the business case for diversity. It should last no more than an hour, and we'll send through a recording afterwards so you can share it with your teammates and also have a look back at anything you want to refer back to afterwards. So what are we going to be running through today? The first step to take when building any diversity program is to get company-wide buy-in. So Sophie, one of our senior talent partners, will be kicking off by running through how to build a compelling business case, drawing from our experience at Instant Impact and from various reports on the subject. Patrick White from Applied, our diversity technology partners, will then be looking at how to use data to report on your successes and to continually communicate about the importance of diversity internally. And James Gordanifer from EY will then share the practical experiences of what EY have done to build the business case for diversity, as well as to track key diversity metrics as they measure their success. We'll then finish off with a Q&A. There is a Q&A box at the bottom of the webinar, so please post any questions you have throughout the session. We may try and answer a few as we go, but as I say, there'll be a section right at the end to run through as many questions as you have. You can ask them to anyone on the panel or anyone in particular if you'd prefer. It is an action-packed agenda, so my other job is to keep us to time, and we hope that it will be a highly informative session that you all take away some immediately actionable insights. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Instant Impact's own Sophie Easter to kick this session off.
Thanks for the introduction, Rob. It's really great to be here today talking about building the business case for diversity. So I can imagine that by taking the time out of your day today to tune into this webinar, you all believe it's the right thing for any company to build a diverse organisation. Yet, when we ran a survey of hundreds of the attendees to the first webinar in our series on driving diversity, we found that just 30% of companies have a board that takes diversity either seriously or very seriously. So ideally, you'll be working with a leadership team who are taking this seriously. They've seen everything that's happening at the moment with the Black Lives Matter movement and will be challenging you on how to become more diverse and inclusive. But what can you do if you're working with the 70% who aren't? Well, to achieve real change, we feel that it has to come from the top. So how can we as business and HR leaders effect change and make sure that all of our leadership teams are taking diversity seriously? Well, we recommend by starting by building your case for change. So giving leaders the background on why this is so important, not just because it's the right thing to do, but also because it's the best thing for your business. So the business case for diversity should be very simple. McKinsey in 2019 report on diversity wins found that companies in the top quartile for ethnic diversity were 36% more likely to have a financial return above their national industry median than companies in the bottom quartile. And for gender diversity, that financial outperformance was 25%. Pretty shocking figures, right? And surely that should be more than enough for every single senior leader to start taking diversity seriously. And yet, whilst leaders typically hang on every piece of advice from McKinsey, this one seems to have been glossed over by many. Perhaps it's that it's a little bit too close to home. So if you look around the boardroom and see a sea of other white men that you like and respect, it's easy to say that those stats don't apply to you because you get it. But that's not necessarily borne out of the data. So the same McKinsey study found a 48% likelihood for most gender diverse executive teams to outperform the least diverse executive teams. In our opinion, one of the reasons why some businesses skate over diversity is because it can be considered a super awkward topic. So opening up a dialogue around overly male or overly white companies is hard, especially as in a lot of cases, you're going to be talking to a white male about how white males are overly represented in the business. Unlike other business transformation programs, diversity affects every level of an organization. So whereas if looking at a digital transformation, it won't necessarily directly affect the CEO, as digital skills won't necessarily play a core part of their role, but it does directly affect the CEO if the board of a business isn't diverse enough. They could very well be part of the problem. That's why I want to make sure when you start to have those conversations internally, you have all the ammo that you need to be successful. So to do that, let's go down a rung deeper and get into why businesses are more successful when they're diverse. So we've identified 4 key areas, the first one being ideas. So if you're not a diverse organisation, you will absolutely be missing out on different perspectives and different opportunities. So in our last webinar on changing perspectives on diverse talent, Mira from the Black Young's Professional Network shared a powerful example from Groupon. They didn't have any Black women in either their sales or product teams. And when they hired a Black woman, she identified that they were missing out on an entire market and $1 billion industry of Black hair products. So Groupon were directly able to improve their product offering and their profitability from just one diverse hire. When we're talking about talent, high quality employees come from every different walk of life. So if you or your leadership team allow yourself to be blinded by the background and the privilege that some of us are blessed with as we grow up and early on in our careers, you will miss out on top talent. And as we all know, a company is only as good as its employees, right? According to another study by Deloitte, Gen Z, more so than any other generation, prioritized diversity, including race, gender, and sexual orientation when considering where to work. So companies will need to consider their stance on diversity to attract the new generation of leaders. As well as this, millennials and Gen Z make up more and more of the workforce, and this expectation to work in a diverse organisation will increasingly affect retention levels too as businesses move forward. When talking about new business, companies that already take diversity very seriously, especially FTSE 250 in the public sector, are starting to focus outside of their own business and on their supply chain. RFPs are increasingly asking about the diversity of suppliers' organisations, and we very much expect this trend to continue. A diverse workforce can also help your business identify new target markets and opportunities, as mentioned earlier with Groupon. In our Diversity Hub videos on attracting diverse talent, we also talk about the virtuous cycle that having a diverse employer brand and brand more generally can have. As you become more diverse, so in turn you become more attractive to diverse customers and prospective employees. These are all really important factors when putting a business case together. But I think to really make your case successful, you're going to want to bring it closer to home. So, how is your business doing? Outline the current diversity within your business. This is where data comes in, and it can be incredibly powerful. We'll have more from on that later from Patrick, I'm sure. But consider the areas that your business could be losing out to competitors or otherwise as a result of lack of diversity, and use those specific examples to make this a tangible pain point for your leadership. If you've crafted your business case well and you have an open leadership team, hopefully you'll start to get responses now like, okay, so what do we want to do about it? We recommend building an action plan to help you drive diversity. So we've split the actions into 3 main areas of focus: attracting diverse talent, creating a fair assessment process, and fostering an inclusive environment. For other short videos and bite-sized resources on each of these topics, go check out our Diversity Hub. I believe Rob will pop a link in the chat. Alternatively, get in touch with one of us and we'd be more than happy to share our methodologies in this area. So with all of these things, if you want to do it properly, there is going to be a cost. There's no denying that. Not a big cost in the grand scheme of things, but a cost nonetheless. So where that's a cost, whether it's a cost for a more diverse jobs board, the cost of advice, or the cost of opportunity and time spent by the team. So there are 2 ways that we've seen HR teams or D&I departments approach this and be really successful. So first of all, make it clear that the business case presents a fantastic return on investment. Hopefully I've helped outline that this morning. The second thing is combining your plan on diversity into a wider audit of your recruitment practices, and especially if you're reliant on recruitment agencies, you should be able to deliver an overall cost saving whilst increasing your diversity spend. And then that becomes very difficult for leadership teams to argue with. Again, if you're interested in finding out more about that, we've got an upcoming webinar on how to build high-performing in-house recruitment teams. So it'd be great to see some of you there. If not, again, please feel free to get in touch and we'd be delighted to go into this further. So once you then have the buy-in from the top and have started to plan how you're going to attract, assess and include diverse talent, you need to make sure that you're influencing internally. So I'll hand over to Patrick very shortly, who will run through the data and reporting component of this. But before I do that, I wanted to finish by touching on diversity and inclusion committees. So at Instant Impact, we've seen D&I committees executed both really well and really poorly. So it's important to gain perspective throughout your organisation on a topic that's as emotive for a lot of people as diversity and inclusion. So the committees that we've seen that work really well have made different people responsible for different parts of the solution, whether that's recruitment or inclusion. And those people have then held the business accountable for change on an agreed schedule. They've also communicated process back to the business, which is really important, so that everybody can transparently see where the focus and attention is going and see the results from it. Committees that haven't perhaps worked as well are those where having the committee itself as part of the end goal and the justification that the organisation is taking diversity and inclusion seriously, even if there's a real lack of change and action around that. So my advice would be set goals on what you want to change and by when, and make sure that whoever's responsible, whether it's a committee or otherwise, delivers to that time frame. So that's pretty much it from me now. So to quickly summarise, to build your business case for diversity, you need to use high quality research like the McKinsey Diversity Wins report to outline the financial benefits of diversity. Explain the wider benefits of diversity like idea generation and brand development. Bring it closer to home by making it as relevant as you can to your business. And have an action plan covering diverse recruitment, inclusion, and how you're going to influence internally. So it was great to talk to you about that today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sophie. Really interesting and leads us on nicely to our next speaker, who's Patrick White. So Patrick's the head of growth projects at Applied, our diverse recruitment technology partners. Their technology allows companies to redesign the way that they assess talent, removing reliance on stages that are poor predictors of in-role performance, such as CV screening, and replacing them with work samples and structured interviews, which are better predictors of performance. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us today. I will stop sharing my screen so that you can take over and have your slides.
Excellent, thank you very much. And thank you, Sophie, and also thank you, Rob and Felix, for inviting me. I'm actually channeling someone else. Deanna is our head of behavioral science research, and she did a lot of the research I'm going to talk about today. Unfortunately, the time zone in Colombia was just a little bit too much, but just imagine me channeling her throughout the talk, as all the heavy lifting has been done by her. I am merely the voice. It's really interesting. As Rob said, we look at technology as ways of minimizing bias, unconscious bias, conscious bias, by a mixture of sort of blinding applications, by looking at the data very closely. But one of the things we have to do in order to do that effectively is to make sure that we have an incredibly accurate picture of how all the different things that we're doing, all the things which we're trying to do, are affecting diversity. And measuring diversity levels is something that most organizations want to do, but many don't actually know how to go about it in a way that's tactful, legal, or even worrying if they should do it at all. I suppose very briefly, I'm just going to make the case of why we need to measure everything. And the reason we need to measure everything is because we are wrong about almost everything. Our intuitive grasp of situations and what the sort of balance and statistics are very, very poor. So to take this study from Ipsos Mori, looking at the difference between sort of the population's average guess of something's prevalence and the reality, you can see it's quite dramatic. So in the UK, I was told that nearly everyone here is from the UK. The average guess of women giving birth between 15 and 19 in the UK is 16%. The reality is only 3%. So it's a 13% difference. Similarly, when you ask the UK population what proportion of the country they think are Muslim, they think 21%. The reality is 5% difference of 16%. And obviously this has changed, sadly, quite dramatically in the case of COVID. But in terms of the pre-COVID population, what do you think were unemployed and looking for work? The average guess was 24%, the reality is 7%, a difference of 17%. So you see that people's average guesses from just sort of looking around them about sort of the demographic situations in the UK are usually wildly wrong by orders of magnitude. And this is for various reasons, but a lot of it comes down to unconscious bias. So these are some of the unconscious bias effects that affect our sort of ability to evaluate situations and sort of pipelines accurately. One is anchoring effects. If we hear one number once, we are suddenly, it sort of highly affects all our estimates afterwards. The availability heuristic, I can never say heuristic, which is essentially that if we can think of an example of something, we think it's much more prevalent than it is. So if we interviewed one person of color, we remember them because they're different, and therefore because we can remember them, we think we interview far more people of color than we do. And this is why we think that winning the lottery is more likely than it is, because we hear constant stories of lottery winners. In reality, it's less likely than being hit by a meteorite. Base rate effects. This is our tendency to wildly overestimate anecdotes. So we remember, if we can think of it, we've got an anecdote of something, we always give it more emphasis than the statistics we heard about, or confirmation bias. Once we believe something, we look for further evidence of it. And there's over 200 cognitive biases that can sort of affect this. So when we're thinking about why we should measure everything, if you're not measuring something, you may not have a concrete grasp of your precise situation. And that does relate to diversity and the sort of balance of your population. But it can relate to all sorts of other things. Even if you do, even if you're one of those people who sort of intuitively looks about them and understands and grasps the sort of the correct numbers without having to measure it, others will not. In fact, the majority of people will not. And you need to convince these people to make changes, that what's working, what's not working. And if you're not measuring it, it's not going to happen. The third is for meaningful change, you need to understand precisely how your different processes are impacting the situation. And I'll talk a bit about this in a minute, and how you can sort of dig down into how sort of individual, even down to individual questions and interview rounds, and how they're affecting your diversity. And finally, you don't know what you don't know. I always think that stories are more powerful than statistics, that anecdotes are more powerful than statistics when you're trying to, often when you're trying to convince people, but sometimes you don't know what stories you're missing and what perspectives you're missing until the data reveals of it. So it's always worth measuring stuff. So how do you go about collecting diversity data in a way that is tactful and legal and also effective? We've done a lot of research with this on the Behavioral Insights team. And two things that I need to mention first. One, sometimes what you can gather differs not just by a country level, but even by a state level in the US. So always check your local laws and guidelines. This is very much sort of UK orientated. The second is any data you collect, you absolutely have to be in compliance with local data laws, and that includes GDPR. So everything I'm going to caveat, make sure that is always the case. But this is the information that we gather, and these are basically set off the broadly protected protected characteristics. So gender, age, broad ethnic group. Different countries look at different ethnic groups in much more detail. For example, in the US, you would have a Native American category, whereas in the UK, that is unusual. Sexuality, disability, and socioeconomic background. And this is particularly interesting because there is not a brilliant way of checking socioeconomic background, but there is strong evidence to suggest that people from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds are among the most discriminated against. In the UK, a classic way to do it is to look at parents' university status and school meals. These are not perfect, these are highly imperfect, and it's still an area of great research on how to better measure socioeconomic background. So how do you ask? I guess this is the next interesting part, is how you ask in a way that's both legally compliant and will encourage people and set people at ease, because people do worry about giving up this information. In France and Germany, they still don't gather this information because of the historical context, which makes them so nervous about having people tagged in this way. So the first is to think about, why do you want it? And you can need to tell people why you want it. The second is, have you allowed people to opt out without penalty? And by without penalty, I mean, have you made it absolutely clear that opting out is not going to impact their application in any way? And the third is, how will you use it? Is it safe? So in terms of what we talk about, we've got two clear missions as a company. It's to make hiring fairer, and we tell candidates that upfront. This is why we're gathering this data, in order to try and make our process fairer and to make sure it appeals to people, or the job appeals to different sorts of people. And the second is because we research hiring behavior. That's what we do. We use a lot of that data to research what's going on. Now, what you want to gather that data for, you can decide for yourselves. I mean, it's probably also to make hiring fairer. We want to check that our hiring is fair, that it's not discriminating against any particular group, and be explicit about that. That is why you're gathering that information. But if there is any other reason, tell them. It's a good thing to do. The second is obviously allowing people to opt out, and that's either on an individual question basis or overall. And the third is to be very clear about how you will use it. So again, this is reiterating, we're using it for research, and we're explicitly saying the data is never sold, never shared with anyone. And what also should be made absolutely clear, if you can't see it buried in here, perhaps we should make it even clearer, is that we are gathering this data as metadata, as in it's not tied to your individual application or your name. It is just looked at as an aggregate, so we can see patterns. So there are some things to remember. You should ask this at the earliest possible moment. And why you need to ask this right up front, the first thing you ever ask will become clear. But basically, you want to know, it's the first thing you want to know about people, because you want to look at every stage of your process and understand that if it's going to, if it's disadvantaging anyone in any way, if it's putting anyone off, that sort of thing. The second is to re-emphasize the why and the how of data should be prominent and clear, not buried in small print. You will actually find that you have a massive increase in people being willing to volunteer this information if you are explicit and bold about why you want it and how you're going to use it. Again, re-emphasize, these are not legal guidelines. Check that you're in compliance with the state and country that you're in at all times. That's GDPR, and anonymous metadata is preferable. And we've done loads of research about sort of maximizing people's willingness to sort of fill in this information. So we did a big study with the Behavioral Insights team over 2018, thousands and thousands and thousands of people applying to all different sorts of jobs. And what we found is that people's willingness to comply about particular questions was quite different, which is quite interesting. So people these days are very, very willing to disclose their gender. Interestingly, they're very interested to disclose their age and also their ethnicity. So 1.6 to 3.5% opt out. Disability, slightly higher. What's really interesting is parents' education and free school meals is the one where people are most reluctant to talk about sort of where they're from, which sort of shows, I guess, the weakness of the socioeconomic questions. But also, a lot of people who are applying from outside the UK will not even have free school meals as a potential. It wouldn't make sense to them as a question. I think there may be a little bit of that going on as well. The second, if we look at the total opt-out of people who decided to opt out completely of the process, it's a little bit higher. So what we have managed to get to is sort of an 87%-ish disclosure rate, and that's by following the steps that I just outlined, which is hopefully useful and is certainly well above benchmarks, but can give you a really clear idea about what's going on. So once you've gathered your data, people are applying to your jobs, what patterns are you looking for? What are you trying to work out where things might be going wrong? Now, the first is how your demographics evolve through every stage of your recruitment process. You don't want to just look at how many applicants you get of a certain demographic and also then at the end, how many people you hired. You want to look at every stage and understand what's going on. The second is that do particular assessments have adverse impacts on different groups? And I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. And the third is how different demographics thrive in the long run. It's all very well hiring a group of diverse people, but if they all quit after 3 months, you maybe wanted to look at your inclusion strategy, your onboarding, all those sorts of things. So in terms of measuring people through the funnel, what you want is something that looks a little bit like this. So say you've got 4 or 5 stages, including the sort of headhunting stage at the beginning. What you want is the different subgroups and to understand how they go through the funnel. So if we look in this case, subgroup 1, let's hypothetically say that is the white male, you can see they make up 40%, 49% of the overall rates through stage 1 and stage 2. But at stage 3, something's going wrong. And at stage 4, something is going wrong even more so. You want these levels to stay moderately consistent throughout the process. But something about stage 3 or possibly stage 4 is disadvantaging subgroup 2. Particularly, you can see that that's taking the biggest drop down. And that's something you want to look at. Now, you could speculate about what that disadvantage might be, and we've got loads of resources about sort of identifying that more accurately, but that is what you want to discover. If you were just looking at the beginning and end of the process, you wouldn't understand exactly where your process is going wrong, to put it another way. The second thing you want to do is measure adverse impact of different questions, of different assessments. So there are three things that you should always, this is from our platform, but you can do it all manually. There are three things that you want to look at when you're looking at an assessment. You want to look at how predictive it is. So does it actually tell you who's good or not? You want to look at how fair it is. Does it disadvantage a particular group? And of course, you want to look at candidate experience. You don't want it to be something that your applicants absolutely hate. And what we want to do is look it down to the individual questions, individual rounds, how fair they are. And there's basically a way to do this. It's quite simple, really. Everything you score, you should be looking at and seeing how different demographics do. And you may find, and this does happen, that there is a particular question or a particular assessment that for some reason a particular demographic does very poorly at. Excuse me, there's a helicopter going up there. What you want to do that in those cases is possibly tweak the assessment or drop it entirely. And I'll give a good example of an adverse impact assessment that was very clear. So one of the top tier strategy consultancies in London, which I will not name, was looking at giving their CV markers an opportunity to sort of rate a CV as good or bad to enter their graduate scheme. Now, what they were said to look for were examples of leadership. But all the examples they gave on the marking rubric were things like being captain of the rugby team or running your Oxfordbridge ball. So of course the markers were looking for things which clearly benefited a certain type of person, the Oxbridge public school male. So although looking for examples of leadership, you could tweak that. You could look for example, community volunteering work or working with your church or whatever other things might have broadened that. But that's an example of a question with an adverse impact on a particular group. And there's lots of others as well. Some of the questions that we've designed over the past have had massive adverse impacts on different groups, and we haven't been able to work out why. There is no clear reason why men are doing much better at this question than women, but they are. And in those cases, we just drop them. If we can't work out why, and it's not an absolutely invaluable piece of data, just move on, find something else. And you will find that sometimes bits of your process will disadvantage particular groups, and you will have no idea why. And it's okay to just drop those entirely. So the last bit which is a whole webinar in and of itself, and there's loads of technology, things like Culture Amp and others which can help with this, is looking at long-term flourishing. So when you've hired people of different groups, maybe who are not used to being in your business, do they flourish? And the key stats to look at here is retention, first year and long-term. So first year retention is absolutely vital. Do they work out in their first year? Do they pass their probation? Do they feel at home? Do they not quit in their first year? But also looking long-term. If you look at, for example, the correlation between senior leaders staying in position, female senior leaders staying in a position and maternity leave length, it's a graph that goes just like this. And so that's the sort of thing you can start to look at. Second is promotion rates. Are you promoting people of color, women, at the same rates as you're promoting everyone else? If you're not, why not? But you need to check that and you need to look at various promotion rates. And the third is subjective reporting of well-being. Sometimes the data will hide things. You need to ask people. And this is where tools like Culture Amp and other sort of pulse-taking bits of tech can be really useful. Are the people of color, are women in your organization feeling comfortable? Are they feeling included? There's absolutely no getting around just asking them. So anyway, that's me. Just very practical tips on how you go about measuring diversity stuff. And I'll stop sharing now so that we can get back to the main slide deck.
Thanks, Patrick. Really appreciate it. I think we've still got your slides up. Great. I will now share my screen and introduce James. So yeah, Patrick, just before passing over to James, really thought-provoking session and fantastic overview on how to use data and reporting. Really enjoyed that. So thank you very much. A reminder to everyone just to continue to ask questions as we go through. We're going to have a Q&A section at the end, but I do have one question for you, Patrick, before passing over to James. So we've had a question from Michelle, which is, what is the benchmark response when collecting data?
A really good question. It's very, very different depending on age group, country, industry, seniority, all sorts of things. But I'll send some data, I'll send some benchmark data over to you afterwards, and you can send it out in the follow-up email.
Great. Yeah, we'll circulate that to everyone then. Fantastic. Thanks, Patrick. And yeah, please do keep those questions coming. So our final speaker is James Godanifar. James is head of student recruitment for EY, one of the UK's largest volume student recruiters. He's responsible for delivering more than 2,000 hires a year and leads a team of 32. He's committed to recruiting for diversity and promoting social mobility, and will be sharing all of his experience at EY. James, thanks for joining us, and over to you.
No problem, thank you. Can I just check as well? Perfect, you got my slides, that's great. I'll just give you a nod when we're ready to move on.
I'll try my best to keep up with you. Thanks, James.
Yeah, no worries. So it's great to be able to talk to you all today. And thank you as well to Patrick and to Sophie for sharing their experiences. If I'm honest, I feel a little bit like they've stolen my thunder, because a lot of the points that I was going to make, they've already made. So hopefully I'll bring them to life a little bit more with perhaps some of the experiences that I've seen within EY. And hopefully share some insight with you that's useful as well. And, you know, obviously happy to take questions, you know, at the end as we go through. I think as a starting point, it's important to say that, you know, it would be disingenuous of me to say that I've gone into EY and created some kind of business case for the chain, you know, for diversity. You know, I've been with EY for around 6 years now. I came into the organisation not in this role. I progressed into this role, and diversity was something even back then that was really prevalent, really prominent. You know, so I've kind of come into an environment that this is part and parcel of what we do and the language that we use. And I'm kind of thinking about, okay, it's a little bit like in lockdown. I don't know if many of you guys have kids at home and you kind of had to do some homeschooling, but, you know, I certainly found with my daughter when I was doing maths and, you know, thinking about division and things like that, and I just couldn't remember like how to actually explain it. And you know, I just do these things now naturally because I've obviously done maths all my life and I do it as part of my role, but I couldn't kind of go backwards and kind of explain the steps that you need to do. And it feels a little bit like that when it comes to diversity for me, because I feel quite blessed to work for a company where this is just accepted. You know, it's absolutely part and parcel of leadership and what they drive, and, you know, the sentiment that we hear. So I'm fortunate in that respect. And if there's anybody on this call that works for organisations where diversity isn't part of the DNA, quite a shock to me, if I'm honest with you. And so kind of building a business case around diversity is really alien thought to me. So it's kind of got me thinking about, well, how would I even go about doing that? So, you know, I've got a couple of things that I would do if I had to start from ground zero. But the other aspect to say as well is it's not, even working for a company like EY where we're really vocal about diversity and passionate about it, it's not perfect, you know. And I think any organisation that says that it is lying. There's nowhere that's got this absolutely spot on, and we're all trying new things all the time, and we're, you know, exploring new ways to improve. And, you know, I think that's one of the key messages really, is that, you know, you've got to be really bold, you've got to be really brave, and you've got to try different things and constantly evolve, because sometimes you'll go down one path and you realize it's not working in the way that you'd hoped, and it's not taking you in the direction, you know, that you've kind of set out, and you need to quickly assess that and change. And the challenge with that sometimes, I think, with diversity is that these things are, you know, it's a very, very long-term plan. It doesn't change overnight. So kind of having to adapt and do something that's going to make impact is really tough. And so you have to be committed to it. So that's one of kind of the first thoughts that I have around this. So if you could just flick on to the next slide, that would be great. So I was trying to kind of think about this whole challenge around, you know, kind of the maths piece, as I mentioned, about, right, how would I even start explaining this to stakeholders if I had to? And I think Sophie kind of touched on quite a lot of these in the principles that she spoke about. So I'm not going to go over them all in detail because, you know, to be repeating what she said. But this kind of point, you know, at the top, the quote there, that's a quote from our current CEO, and it's all over our website and, you know, our microsite when it comes to diversity and so on. And I think it's such an important message. You know, it's not something that is just a buzzword. You know, every company on their website and kind of in their attraction strategy are talking about diversity. It really isn't a nice to have. It's an absolute imperative. And for me, that's the starting point. You know, if I had to convince somebody of why diversity was important for their organization, it starts with belief. Like, you've got to believe this stuff. You've got to connect with why. And if you've never seen it, there's a brilliant TED talk, which is by a guy called Simon Sinek. And it's about the golden circle. So maybe in the chat box, Felix, if you can find that, just pop it in there, because it's an absolutely brilliant concept. If you've got to convince somebody of something, you know, the principle of it is you've always got to start with why. And I really believe that, and I think it's a brilliant principle. I've used it ever since I saw that TED talk, you know, and I really believe that you have to connect with kind of the rationale as to why diversity is important. If you don't believe that, that's going to be really hard to sell. So you've got to explore all of this rationale and these reasons, and all of the kind of things that, you know, kind of I've put here and that Sophie's mentioned. They're business drivers. They're about results. They're about outcome. So that language is absolutely what you should be talking about with senior leaders and stakeholders. And you know, the research that's been done by EY, by Deloitte, by McKinsey, you name it, there's research everywhere. If you need data, if you need to back up your stats and why these things are important and how ultimately diversity drives business results, you've got plethora of choices in front of you. So, you know, I would definitely say kind of start with why, get connected with the rationale behind it, have your data in a good place in terms of case studies and examples, and go in there with a really strong argument and be brave. If you have to convince somebody, and this might, you know, I don't know whether I'm meant to say this or not, but if you have to convince your leadership that diversity is important, I would really question why you were working in that organization in the first place. So I'm really sorry to kind of throw quite a bold statement out there, but I feel that strongly about diversity. And if they don't connect with that, then that's a pretty worrying perspective. So definitely go in there, be brave, and be bold. And, you know, as I say, it's not perfect at EY. Not everybody thinks this and believes this. And sometimes I come up against senior stakeholders who will challenge us as a recruitment function because they want to recruit in that old mold, you know, of, you know, kind of the boys club that went to Oxbridge or whatever. And we have to challenge them, and we have to really challenge their thinking. And it all comes back to the belief in why diversity is important and all of the kind of data and the stats and so on. And that's a really tough thing to do. It's few and far between at EY. It's unfortunate in that respect, but it does happen. You know, and I think having been clued up on all the rationale is really, really important. So if you could just click on to the next slide, that would be great. Cool. The next bit for me is kind of goes part and parcel really with the previous point, but you've really got to understand the differences between diversity and inclusiveness. I think some people, you know, I've observed kind of focus on one and not necessarily the other, and it's come up a lot through the discussions, you know, and a lot of this extends beyond recruitment, so I'm not going to go into kind of all the things you can do within an organization around an inclusivity strategy, but you know, you've got to really understand that there is a delineation between the two. You know, diversity is all about recognizing, you know, all the different backgrounds that we saw in the previous presentation, whether it's age or race or sexuality, you know, where you went to school, you know, even to things like your religion or your, you know, the way that you think, disability. You know, there are so many facets of diversity, but it means nothing unless you can unlock that and bring it to life. You know, you can have the most diverse workforce or team in the world, and if you don't really engender that and bring it kind of out of people through creating an inclusive environment where people can be themselves, not afraid to speak up, put their opinions forward, feel safe, feel that they can contribute, it counts for nothing. So, you know, kind of that ability to unlock those differences, that's the inclusivity part. And it's really important to understand the two and the part that you play in doing that and helping to educate leadership around those differences. So I think that is another really important thing that I begin to stress. If we just flick on one more slide, great. So this is the bit kind of I want to get to in terms of then, I guess, my map of the world, which is, you know, student recruitment and early careers. And I give you some practical tips. And some of this, you know, as I mentioned, elements of this has come up in the previous presentations that you heard, but hopefully bring it a little bit more to life in terms of, you know, what I've experienced at EY. I think the first thing is that it's a huge journey. As I mentioned, it's going to take time. So the starting point is really understanding what the objectives are, and what are, you know, having something measurable that you can shoot towards. So if, you know, I think about our current journey in terms of female hires, you know, we aspirationally want to get to 50% female hires within student recruitment at that kind of entry level within the firm, and progressively throughout the firm at every level get to that point over time. You know, to try and achieve that in the space of a year, so creating an arbitrary target of, right, we're going to hit 50%, you know, when the popularity of our industry, you know, the average application is 41% female for professional services. You know, how do you go from 41% females applying to the organisation to 50% overnight? It's just not going to happen. So really understanding realistic targets and having kind of a really clear plan in place incrementally to get to where you need to be over time is a really important starting point. Because if you're shooting for something that's unrealistic, let's face it, it's going to be disempowering for the team and potentially kind of unmotivating as well. So, you know, nobody wants that. You've got to be realistic in terms of what you're shooting for, and then work backwards in terms of your strategy, obviously, you know, to get there. You've also got to understand the kind of market forces. So if you think about what's happened this year around, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement and how prominent, you know, that, you know, recruiting has been around this particular subject, you know, you've got to understand, again, what is realistic. You know, one area of the business spoke to us recently about a target for Black students this year, and they just gave us an arbitrary target, I think, of 10 to 15%. We want 10 to 15% of our hires to be Black. You know, we want to do our part and so on and so forth, which is great that they've kind of got the emphasis to do that. But the reality is only 8% of the graduate market are Black. So again, why would a target of 15% makes no sense? It's not representative of society in terms of the pool that we're kind of recruiting from. You've got to have that kind of information to hand. So that is a really important part of that dialogue, is that understanding your market and the market forces and everything that kind of sits around that. So if I then think about the three kind of facets of student recruitment that will really impact diversity, now if I start with employer brand, some of the key things that I would call out, you know, you've got to be comfortable talking about the topic of diversity and showcasing what your organization is doing, and then putting role models out to market, whether it's through your website or through events or whatever it might be. You know, I think I've seen in the chat there's already something representative about this panel today. You know, fair enough, fair comment. You know, kind of the representation of your organization, if you're trying to attract a more diverse pool, has to be representative. So that's a really important part of kind of what we're doing around our employer brand. There's elements like you may or may not even think about, things like the language that you use within job descriptions or within your website. And there are tools out there to scan the language that you're using to say, is that appealing to a diverse audience, or potentially is that type of language actually attracting one particular type of audience? And, you know, kind of there's a lot of science that goes behind that. So kind of running your job descriptions or your website through this kind of filter is really important to understand what's the message we're actually putting out there in terms of how we're describing or depicting ourselves as well. I also think then, you know, kind of as it comes through to the world of what we call attraction, so outreach, relationships with campuses and schools, you know, for apprenticeships as well, it's so important to be bold and tackle this subject. You know, we speak specifically about what it's like to be a female within a firm like ours, or to be a Black student, you know, and to have a career, and what it's like in terms of, you know, kind of the the kind of nature of our organization specifically for that audience. You have to be bold, you have to be comfortable targeting the specific demographics that you're looking to do more with. And you probably hear the term positive action. An understanding of what you can and can't do there is really important, and enabling and encouraging candidates from specific demographics is absolutely within your gift. So if you have an underrepresentation in terms of Black students or female students or people with disabilities, enabling and encouraging those students to apply to you is absolutely, as I say, within your gift. So feeling bold and confident to be able to do those things is really important. You've then got things in terms of how you segment your audience. So thinking about, different courses that have, more of certain demographics attending those courses. Obviously, you would choose to target those societies, etc. One of the things that we've really benefited from, both in employer brand and our attraction activity, has been around partnerships. There are specialist third parties that are focused on specific demographic groups. And they've been a huge asset to us over the past couple of years in helping us bolster and support those demographics and bringing more of that demographic into our organisation as well. So kind of advocate all those kind of key points. Then in terms of the recruitment process, I think we really firmly believe that it's important from an early careers point of view to hire for potential. And on the previous presentation, there was commentary about I think it was a management consultancy that was looking for where you captain of the rugby club and so on and so forth. I can't tell you, 5-6 years ago, there were still elements of that at EY, and we were looking at CVs and we were looking at kind of examples. I'm a massive believer that at this stage in somebody's career, you've got to hire for potential. You've got to put processes in place to look at somebody performing at face value, not what they've done in the past, because some people have privileges that others will never have had the opportunity to have. And that point around people from underprivileged socioeconomic backgrounds, there are absolute fantastic candidates that we would never have seen before had we worked with that kind of recruitment process. But we've adopted a fully strengths-based recruitment process. We're looking for potential, and we judge candidates based on face value. We don't look at CVs. We're completely CV blind. We look purely about how candidates perform in our recruitment process, and I think that's such an important point. There are also tools around things like social mobility that you can really look at it more objectively rather than a subjective point of view, and they will look at things like the school that they attended when they're at secondary school, to look at the area, the level of deprivation and their grades in the context of how they performed in that school. You can get really sophisticated with this kind of stuff, but really advocate hiring for potential. It's absolutely key. And then I'm not going to go into all the detail on this because I'm very conscious of time, but the point was made again on the previous presentation. You've got to be fanatical about your data. You've got to have all your ducks in a row, and you've got to be absolutely kind of obsessed with measuring every single data point that you can get your hands on, because it's through data that you're going to understand how you can constantly iterate and improve your recruitment process to ensure that you are minimizing any kind of bias or adverse impact. It's the data that really pinpoints, is the assessment right? Is it fair? Are candidates progressing? If you remember the slides on that previous presentation, the group that started at 40-something%, ended up at 60%, we absolutely, we hunt that down aggressively. We're constantly looking at it every month. We're looking at every single assessment, every assessor, every area of our business. Is there bias? Is there adverse impact? If there is, how can we change that? What can we do right here, right now, to make a difference, to improve the chances of candidates that come from that particular demographic? And again, I'll be honest with you, we've not got it perfect, but no one has. And if they say they have, they're lying. It's a constant iterative approach. And you've got to be kind of just absolutely relentlessly focused in your pursuit of making your recruitment process fair. And that the whole feedback loop there comes back to training, obviously, of your interviewers and your assessors, and some of those bold conversations with the business. If you do find that bias, that's a whole different ballgame. I'm going to stop there because I'm really conscious that I've taken up quite a bit of time, and I think you wanted to do some Q&A and so on with all of us. So I hope that's been useful. Thanks for inviting me along as well.
Awesome. Well, massive thanks there, James. I thought in particular, the idea of not having diversity as part of the DNA being alien to you, I think is hopefully a foresight to where we'll be in 5-10 years time across organizations of all sizes. And I also love that you threw down the gauntlet, and if your leadership don't connect with this issue, then maybe you're working in the wrong place. So lots of food for thought there. Also like to thank our other panelists. I hope that Sophie's overview of some key reports, as well as how we approach building business cases at Instant Impact, could give you some useful information to take away. And Patrick, particularly really enjoyed the great insight into the use of data. Found it very interesting that those from a lower socioeconomic background are among those that are most discriminated against when you look at the data across lots of different clients. So again, lots of food of thought for all of us. So just moving on to Q&A, we've had a few good questions come in. So I think the first question I just wanted to throw over to you in the first instance, Patrick, but then to James afterwards is, do these techniques rely on having a large volume of jobs and applicants? Would they work in a smaller organization or just a few hundred people and tens of recruitments a year?
Yeah, absolutely. Most of our customers are under 200 people in terms of the size of the organizations. I mean, what I didn't have time to dig into is when you are looking at data, you do need to make sure it's what they call statistically significant. So if you've only got 5 applicants and one of them happens to be a person of color, if that person doesn't get hired, it's not necessarily a sign of discrimination. And if you are dealing with small numbers of applicants, perhaps you need to look at multiple roles so you get sort of enough data to really sort of start to look at patterns. But absolutely, even a small organization probably has sort of 50, 60, 100 applicants per role at the moment. I saw one admin role with 500 applicants on our system the other day. So there's plenty of data out there. As I say, some of our customers are as small as 10 people. So yeah, absolutely, this all works even in small organizations.
And James, would be really interested in your thoughts here, being at an organisation the size of EY. If you were to go into and be airlifted into a company of hundreds of people and making, let's say, 10 hires a year, what would be the first steps you would take? Because I appreciate you can't do the same things at the scale as when you have a 32-person team.
Yeah, exactly. I think that point around being statistically significant is really important. So the first step is to make sure that you are capturing data in whatever form, and if you've not got a really sophisticated, applicant tracking system and so on, you're using something off system, is getting that into a shape where actually you can bring that into something meaningful over time, of course. So I think that's really important. I think then it does link back to the hiring practices as well. So, irrespective of the data point, which I think over time, you can gather with those kind of volumes, you've got to make sure that rigor around assessment and the kind of interviewer or assessor training that you have in place is really thorough, so that you're doing what you can at the front end as well as with people to minimize any kind of bias as well.
Yeah, I think the thing I'd add onto that point, Total, I think James mentioned a number of times that no organisation is perfect in this area. It's a constant strive to improve and get better. I think whatever size your organisation, the activity you can commit to it is going to be different, but you can always strive to get better, whether that's having more high quality data and reporting or doing a few extra activities to attract candidates from pools that you haven't had previously before. A question for James as well. So do you think that CEOs can or should publicly announce the specific aims or targets for diversity, or are there any elements of those that should remain internal, knowing that you're big on promoting the employer brand Total and being a diverse organisation, but how far do you want to take it from a target perspective externally?
That's a good point. It can be uncomfortable, but I think it has to be. If that's my view, if I think about that on the back of what we've seen this year with Black applicants and students and in society in general, we've been really bold and it's really uncomfortable. Like it took, I think, God, in maybe around kind of July time, somebody in the team kind of challenged me directly around being more vocal around the subject. And you know, kind of it really took me by surprise, because I thought, like, as an individual, this is the kind of stuff I'm good at, and I talk about this and so on. But then kind of in my happy world as a white man, I obviously wasn't doing it enough. And you know, they gave me that direct feedback, and that was a really important turning point for me. That if you'd have asked me that question 3 months ago, maybe I would have been a bit like, you know, actually there's some stuff you need to kind of be careful about, perhaps share kind of big ticket items perhaps outwardly and then focus on X, Y, and Z internally. But I think you've got to be completely bare and totally open and transparent and authentic. And you know, if the target is X, everybody should know that, and everybody should be accountable for achieving that. Because otherwise, nothing's going to change. So that would be my view.
Great, and you touched on it before, the difference between positive action and positive discrimination. We need to be careful that when we are setting targets, they don't then lead us down the route of positive discrimination. So if you're unsure on that one, do take legal advice, or we have other resources on the website as well. I think James mentioned there being a white male. I think I clearly fall into that back bracket as well, and also wanted to address Michelle's point that she raised and the challenge on the diversity of our panel today. Just wanted to thank you for your feedback. We know we need to practice what we preach in this area, and we'll endeavour to improve further webinars whilst making sure that we always have focus on the highest quality speakers. It was a shame that Diana couldn't join from Applied today, but I hope you'll agree that Patrick stood in more than ably, and yeah, we'll focus on that moving forward. I think we've got time for one last question, which is around specifically disabilities. So I think good question for Patrick, this one, but how do you ensure that candidates with disabilities are treated fairly when their very disability might actually influence the assessment that they're taking in a blind, strength-based assessment world?
Yeah, no, it's really it's really tricky, and I think the challenge talking about disability is lumping everyone in together who has some form of disability, because obviously disabilities can be incredibly varied. In fact, there's probably more variation within disability than there is between disability and any other category or any other group. The people I would really recommend on this are a jobs board who put out lots of information called Even Break. They're a disability job board who work in the UK, and we work quite closely with them. They're very thoughtful about how you can help people with various disabilities to be on an even playing field. I mean, a lot of the things that you can do to remove bias in general will aid the disabled community. So moving from sort of chats to sort of structured interviews, so everyone's answering the same questions, so you don't let your sort of biases slip in. Making sure that you are aware of those disabilities ahead of time, and making sure that you've asked them whatever reasonable adjustments need to be required. And all the other classic things like blinding interviews, blinding sort of applications, so they're not CV based, and so they're work sample based, can help as well. But it's really difficult in terms of making people feel comfortable divulging that information. That's why it needs to be in maximum sort of huge print when you're gathering this information, that this information is not tied to your individual application. This is general data that we use to look for patterns. It's absolutely not tied to your application. And that's usually hidden away in the small print, but actually that should be put front and center. But as I said, I'm not the expert on this. There's so much variation within the disabled community. I really recommend getting specialist advice on that one.
Well, thank you all again, James, Patrick, Sophie. Really appreciate you joining today and sharing your experiences on this topic. Just a couple of last things before we finish. There will be a feedback form sent around. It will, I promise, only take 2 minutes or so. We really would appreciate that feedback, so we can make the further webinars in our series on driving diversity through recruitment as useful as possible. On that topic of upcoming webinars, we've got a couple coming up shortly. So we've got one on attracting diverse talent. We'll do a deep dive into attraction on Wednesday, the 7th of October. We've also got one on how to build a high performance in-house recruitment team on Wednesday, the 21st of October. Other resources to look out for if you haven't already seen them. We've got our diversity hub. We've got a load of bite-sized videos and resources on the topic. We'll also post this webinar online so you can review and share. Really hope that you've all enjoyed today's session. If you do want to follow up on any of the topics raised, do get in touch, and we look forward to seeing you at future webinars. Thank you very much.